In this, the 21st lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine public policies that have a strong tendency to stress the stability of our socio-political arrangements and institutions, as well as the physical environment. Political economy teaches us that politics dictates economic outcomes. What is also true is that how we are organized is a fundamental cause of many of the so-called natural disasters that destroy what we produce and take many human lives. Over the decades, the economics profession has come under heavy criticism from without and within, sometimes based on strongly held ideological perspectives. An important issue is whether the evidence in the real world provides answers. The intellectual and ideological arguments have a long history. From those who today we describe as on the right have come challenges against an expanded public sector and against what is viewed as too much regulation and intervention. From the left have come calls for more in-depth planning, nationalization of essential industries, and a strongly enforced regulatory environment. On the eve of the Keynesian Revolution in 1935, the economist A.C. Pigou offered a view that continues to have relevance for us today. Pigou wrote, "Discussions of the relative merits of different types of economic organization are likely to have an all or none flavor. Yet the world is not simple, and no completely pure form of economic organization is likely to emerge. Our economy is mixed. The relative importance of different ingredients in the mixture is constantly changing." The mixed economies emerging after the Second World War each struggled to find the right balance between an enlarging public sector, the global corporatization of production and commerce, and the responding organization of workers into huge labor unions. More recently, citizens in many countries have come together around important societal issues and how to respond to the accelerating concentrations of income and wealth. In 1949, a group of economists held a symposium to discuss growing concerns over the formation of cartels and monopolies. Among the participants was Arthur Burns, then at Columbia University. Burns' assessment was that we have failed to achieve a competitive system at all closely resembling that which was in the minds of the economists of the last century. The reasons for this failure lie partly in the forces within the economic system operating in a contrary direction to the legislation and partly to difficulties of achieving competition by law. If the accelerated growth of big business concerned the future chairman of Dwight Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors, he was not alone among his contemporaries. To the observations made by Burns, Princeton professor Frank Fetter added the following. Fetter wrote, "Among the influences tending to make the antitrust laws relatively ineffective are the neglect by Congress to seek much needed aid of a technical nature in the framing of economic legislation, the pressure of organized special interests and skilled lobbyists in such legislation, the expenditure by corporations of lavish sums to defeat the enforcement of the antitrust laws, sums much greater than those spent by the government in their enforcement, and the extensive employment of academic economists in defense of monopoly." Remember, this was the view of a prominent economics professor in 1949. Looking to the future in 1951, Mariner Eccles added his own concerns regarding inflation expressed by U.S. Senator Paul Douglas. Have we avoided this supreme folly? The answer is that we have not. In the 5 years between VJ Day and Korea, the repeated efforts the Federal Reserve made to deal with a prime source of inflation got nowhere. Within the administration, the Treasury Department, with its chronic institutional bias toward cheap money, had the final say on monetary and credit policies. There was no justification for the Treasury's insistence that the Federal Reserve System adhere to a policy of purchasing government securities at the will of the holders and at fixed prices. Such action did not assure confidence in the credit of the government. Instead, it fostered the unwarranted growth of bank reserves that fed the inflation fires, and these fires slowly consumed the purchasing power of the dollar. A widely held view at the time was that the United States had entered the 1950s with the world's most dynamic economy. After all, the nation was blessed with abundant natural resources, including oil and natural gas, and its industrial capacity was modern and intact. In 1976, historian Godfrey Hodgson reflected on the benefits and costs of this unique position held by Americans. The abundant society could short-circuit the two quintessential questions of politics, the question of justice and the question of priority. Who gets what? What must we do first? In other words, economic growth would solve the problem of poverty without having to actually interfere with the distribution of wealth and income that characterize the United States, and similarly, the rest of the developed social democracies. The problem was that keeping an economy on a path of sustained growth remained an ongoing challenge. From the end of the Second World War, there have now been 11 recessionary contractions of varying durations. Demographics complicated the direction of the United States economy as the 1950s were coming to an end. In 1950, the number of college graduates reached 432,000, double the number who finished college in 1940. Several million young adults completed college using benefits under the 1944 GI Bill of Rights. By 1968, there were over 6 million students enrolled in the nation's colleges and other post-high school institutions. Another major development was the migration of people from rural regions to the cities. Where crops could be planted and harvested by new farming machines, the need for farm workers and even farming families was reduced. Rural communities, dependent upon a large number of family farms to support local commerce, lost their reason for being. The increase in the size of the average farm is not the only reason for the decline in rural population, but the shift to more corporate agribusiness has played an important role. The migration of African Americans from the South, many of whom were sharecroppers or tenant farmers, to the industrial cities of the North and West Coast is another important component of this population shift. In 1940, African Americans comprised roughly 40% of the population in the South. Of 13 million African Americans, 10 million were living in the South. This concentration was to rapidly change during and after the Second World War. Employment in the steel mills and packing houses of Chicago attracted tens of thousands of African Americans to Chicago. After the war, the introduction of mechanical cotton picking machines reduced the need for workers in the cotton fields, and the next wave of migration north and west followed. Throughout the southern states, more than half of all families, black and white, own no land. They sharecropped. Absentee landowners, including foreign-owned companies, controlled virtually all the mineral assets throughout the South, paying low taxes and fees for extracting this wealth. Thus, there was little revenue collected by Southern governments to develop infrastructure, provide educational opportunities, or develop other public goods and services. The movement of people in the United States from rural regions to the cities began in earnest during the 1920s and has continued ever since. However, to more accurately describe this migration, we must remember that the definition of an urban area dramatically changed beginning in the 1950s as the land surrounding urban centers was converted from open space or agricultural production to suburban communities, and then to edge cities, described in 1991 by Joel Garreau. He wrote, "Americans are creating the biggest change in 100 years in how we build cities. Every single American city that is growing in the fashion of Los Angeles, with multiple urban cores. This pattern of settlement has made the United States automobile dependent and required the expenditure of huge sums to replicate the infrastructure required by communities again and again. Another dramatic change in the cultural norms existing in the United States was the decline in multi-generational family households that occurred beginning in the late 1940s. Difficult economic circumstances, a rising cost of living, and our aging population is reversing this trend to some extent. New family formations and the construction of single-family detached housing units to accommodate the single-generation household triggered this shift, and highway construction provided the pathways for people to travel quickly from home to work and home again. Another important characteristic of the United States population is the continued influx of people from other countries. As this 2008 chart shows, there is a very direct correlation between family size and whether the individuals are native-born or foreign-born. The global increase in population is a major concern among many scientists who believe we are approaching the limit of the Earth's capacity to support the lifestyle we have become accustomed to. In too many countries, the daily struggle is to secure enough food to prevent starvation. Over 1 billion people have no access to clean water or sanitary systems of waste removal. Others have concluded that although scarcity seems to be a common denominator to all societies, such scarcity has more to do with socio-political arrangements and institutions than with what nature provides. In 1968, the population issue was heightened by publication of the book The Population Bomb by Paul R. Ehrlich. Ehrlich warned of widespread starvation and advocated strong measures to limit human population growth. His concerns over population came after reading the 1962 book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Carson described how DDT entered the food chain and accumulated in the fatty tissues of animals, including human beings, and caused cancer and genetic damage. She demonstrated that DDT and other pesticides had contaminated the entire world food supply. In recent years, however, DDT has been reintroduced with stricter controls over how and where it is used. Some may recall this troubling image from the 1950s. The world's population in 1968 stood at 3.5 billion. Just 4 decades later, we number 6.7 billion and growing. Yet, if anything, poverty has worsened around the globe with each passing decade because none of the necessary, essential changes to the way societies are organized have occurred. In a recent reassessment of the science presented in his book, Ehrlich notes that since 1968, over 300 million people have died due to hunger and hunger-related diseases. And today, 1 person in 6 goes hungry every day. Someone dies of starvation every 3.6 seconds. 3 out of every 4 is a child. And that does it for lesson 21.